Welcome to the Filmmaker's Playbook. My name is Jason Branagan and this is a podcast all about filmmaking. On today's show, I talk to Academy-award and Emmy-award winning director, writer and producer, Edward Zwick. Ed's credits include Glory, Legends of the Fall, The Siege, Courage Under Fire, Blood Diamond, The Last Samurai and Jack Reacher, Never Go Back, amongst many others. In our conversation, we discuss Ed's must-read book, Hits, Flops and Other Illusions. We cover a wide array of topics, including how he approaches writing, the notes process, how he facilitates his rehearsals to deliver award-winning performances, how he works with his composers, and much, much more. I hope you enjoy today's episode. Thank you for listening. Ed Zwick, thank you very much for joining me. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Nice to meet you.
You too. So look, first and foremost, I want to say thank you for writing Hits, Flops and Other Illusions. I think it's a must read. It's entertaining, it's insightful, it's honest. And what I love most in film books, it comes with lots of actionable tips and advice. I would love to start by talking a little bit about your time at AFI. In the book, you say that Marshall goaded you to work harder. And I'm really curious when I read that as to what did working harder look like? And what was it that propelled you through that first year at AFI after experiencing, as you put it, such overt failure when you first went in and started making work?
Yeah, several things. I had been the product of a progressive education, some very supportive teachers, a good university, but very academic. And I had never really encountered the ethos of a conservatory. And a conservatory is very different. You know, in a university setting, you are given a curriculum and you're supposed to learn it and assimilate it and repeat it in some way or make it your own. But the idea is that it teaches you something in order to learn something. And the conservatory is sort of the reverse, which is to say that you don't learn in order to do, you do in order to learn. You begin right away, deep into the pool, by doing these things and failing magnificently with the assumption that that experience will begin to aggregate into something meaningful. And I don't think that I was necessarily lazy, but I was oddly complacent. And I didn't really put my work to the fire, my feet to the fire about that process. And as I found out very quickly that good was not good enough, I think also that I had a number of impediments that I didn't know were impediments, and they were the critical voices that existed on my shoulder. They were the voices of teachers, and they were voices of parents, and the voices of what is appropriate and what is acceptable, and I really was trying to serve those voices rather than serve myself. And Marshall was one of those artists who, unlike me, was sort of just full blown out of some Zeus head of creativity when he was very young. He had many inhibitions of his own that I think I was able to help him with, but we're not there yet in the process. And I think he as a kind of scourge, not cruelly, but authentically, was able to address or point them out to me, not necessarily correct those things that I was prisoner of. And some of them were as varied as a desperate need to please or a desire to be accepted or these very ineffable impetuses that you have when you're young. And when you're accustomed to being a kind of institutionally acceptable creature, which is, I think, what I was. And I think he really, in the most general sense, was a real help in that. And then there were other ways that are also important. Marshall had been in psychoanalysis since he was about 6 years old, as best I can tell. And his willingness to confront very scary notions of one's self was a revelation to me. And that was another thing that was really important as the growth. I mean, it's not as if I'd been blithe. In fact, I'd had a lot of vaguely traumatic things happen that I had been utterly willing to deny and ignore. And so some combination of all those things, in addition to which he had a wonderful ear for dialogue, which I'm not sure that I had yet. And then I will turn it around by saying that there were things that were significant gaps in his arsenal. And one of them had to do with a certain thing that I think I had, which was some classical training had taught me structure in a way that was really helpful. And whether it's the classical unities or having studied classical literature or having been exposed to any number of different kinds of theatrical unities that he lacked, that I was really able to plug gaps for him. And even a theatricality. I had been a person of the theater. I had really immersed myself from a very young age and even directed from a very young age. But it was mise en scène of a thing already done, say, a piece of material that I would interpret as opposed to create. That's a long-winded way of saying that we decided that between the two of us, we might be one full artist.
Did your work then become bolder and braver?
Yes, but not right away at all. I don't want to suggest that it was like, okay, I got that. In fact, I really did pay attention in film school, and I did do the work, and the work got a little better. But even as I went out into the world in the first couple of years of work, and even as I began to get work, it was quite mediocre, and I was unable to really understand how to make that leap from the internal experience to the external work. And I don't think that moment of revelation came it was another 2 or 3 years of work until it began to dawn on me. Some of the things they had taught me or tried to teach me in school began to, the penny dropped. And I went, oh, that's what they meant. And that's what it is. And what if I did this? And it was all there. That's the thing about learning. The problem with learning is in the real world, you tend to take the exam first and then you do the learning. And fortunately, I had time and I was able to get work because I was a good mimic. I could imitate those things that people wanted me to do. And therefore, I was employable. But I was not satisfying myself or breaking any new ground in terms of finding my own voice.
Did family give you an opportunity to begin to find your own voice? Do you feel you found?
I would say no. I would say that was still more in the mimicry stage, and consequently, as good to me as these people were, they were wonderful to me. I would say Carol McKeon probably rewrote 7/8 of what I wrote. I mean, I did them a service by often breaking stories and giving them a shape that could be worked with, but I was not yet ready to dig in the way that I realized that I would have to dig into interpersonal drama and the sort of breath of life in the work wasn't there. And it was a wonderful education because I was able to watch a lot of other journeyman directors work in the meat and potatoes of putting something together very quickly. We shot episodes in 6 days and we finished stories in a week or in scripts. It was like finger exercises for the piano. It was real, just basic storytelling with a camera, which I was able to observe and then see them cut together and see how that worked. And so it was being in a very sophisticated, very humanist factory. And I will say one thing though, is that Carol is a very talented writer, Carol McKeon. And one thing that I saw that she was willing to be subversive in a way that I hadn't thought was, I just wasn't willing to do necessarily. And And finally, they were valuing a certain kind of liberal humanism that was very appealing to me, and I'd seen, and is very much the part of the American narrative film tradition that I had already seen in film school. I'll digress about one thing, which is that what you have to understand about the AFI at that moment is that those guys who had created the genre were still alive. King Vidor and Orson Welles and our Alfred Hitchcock, they would all come and talk to us. We would be sitting at the feet of these giants, and they had something that they believed in, and they wanted to promulgate. They wanted to pass it on to a generation of filmmakers. And it wasn't just my class; it was the few classes before me where it had begun, and the classes for the 10 years that followed. But it was a moment. It was a moment when they were available. And they were all there, just up the hill in Bel Air and Beverly Hills, and they wanted to come and talk, and they did, and that engendered great respect and great desire to be part of a tradition. At the same time, it was very disturbing because once you got out of there, you realized the world was no longer the same world that they had been party to, and the opportunity to do it was very different in terms of how it was legislated.
If I could just touch on that one, that's incredible. What a joy of an experience. Being in Los Angeles and in Hollywood seems to have been an important part of building your career and opened you up to that world, and even mentors. You mentioned Sidney Pollack in the book. Do you think that being in Hollywood and in Los Angeles is as important today or as effective as it was when you were building your career?
No, not at all. Because, I mean, for several reasons, one of which is that we're able to be virtual in this particular way that you and I are, everyone is able to be. Some of that, by the way, is a detriment. I think there is something in the nature of a Zoom call and a Zoom meeting, which obliges me to talk and you to talk and to stare at one another. And when you multiply that by 5 or 6 people, you don't get that stuff of interplay where we interrupt each other and we riff with each other and things happen and or you look away and it's a different dynamic, and I think that's missing. But the way that the business works now is very balkanized, and particularly post-COVID, add that to it. And once people saw that they didn't have to drive across the valley and to get into, the whatever around this unmanageable city, it was codified to be like that. So that's part of it. But the other thing is the executives now, and even young directors, I think, and I've spoken to many, they're obliged to look at so much work that's being done all the time that they feel it's attended upon them to be current with, oh God, how many hours of, I think, often mediocre stuff, but they feel they have to know about, to watch and compare themselves to. And that's a burden, because what is lost is the retrospective look at some of the great work that came before. There is much less reverence, but the work is farther back. It seems more antique. It seems less interesting in some way. And in some way it is less interesting, but in many ways it's more interesting because the themes and the ambition of storytelling and of ideas and some of the classical unities are just they're no longer thought to be useful or contemporary, and so things feel to me, with very notable exceptions, obviously. But there's something that's redundant. It's also a factor of the algorithm and the what has happened in the business now. But we're getting ahead of ourselves there. But the answer to your question is it's still good because it's a hothouse where you're going to meet a lot of other people who have come for that same reason as you. And if you're lucky, you find your tribe and your collaborators. You find people who will be important to you and from whom you will keep learning, as Marshall and I kept learning as we taught each other through our experiences and observed each other closely. You're not going to get that a lot of other places, I don't think. You would get it in New York, you'd get it in London, you'd get it places. But once you're done with school, you're on your own.
Yeah.
And can you create those collectives of just friends or collaborators who will be important to you? I mean, I'd like to think. I grew up in Chicago, and a lot of friends of mine were from the Steppenwolf Company in Chicago, the theater company, and they went into to a basement of a junior high school or a high school in Highland Park, Illinois, and created this voice of a company in the theater. And there's no reason why that couldn't happen now. And there are things happening in the Florida Project. There are things happening that Barry Jenkins and some other guys are doing down there. And there are obviously little places where this could be happening because all the technology is available, and it's actually affordable. And that could be a lovely way to do what we did here and do it wherever you are.
Okay. I'm going to go back to family. You mentioned that family was the second best thing that happened to you. It being cancelled was the first.
Yeah.
I love that idea. I was curious at the time, is that what it felt like? Did that feel freeing for you then to go and
It
push
did.
on?
It did. I mean, it had given me one thing. It had given me some money, which I never had. And I'd put some money in the bank. And that was a comfort, certainly. And I certainly confronted then the freelance life of trying to then support myself doing it as an artist as opposed to working as a reader as I did and things like that. I mean, obviously, the absence of a paycheck was a loss, but it forced me to try to begin to invent my own universe. It forced me to begin writing on spec. It forced me to come up with ideas for pitches and try to sell them. And I was able to do it now once or twice. And the combination of these things really began to be the bulwark of a more productive imagination that actually was able to invent things and things that other people might be interested in, things that I was interested in, first of all. I was very interested in Tibetan Buddhism at the time, and I pitched a story about an American GI in Korea who's asked to go to Tibet in 1952 to help the Dalai Lama flee from the Chinese invasion. And he ends up in a lamasery because his plane crashes. And then he has a very interesting confrontation with Eastern thought. I pitched a story about the first year of coeducation in an American university, of which I had been a part, and remembered a sign on the door that said, never be a pioneer. It's always the earliest Christian that gets the hungriest lion. And that was about men and women at a very crucial moment in sort of cultural history. Things like that. I pitched them. I wrote them. I got paid to write them. Nobody wanted to do them. But nonetheless, that was a real foothold. And then I was able to actually begin to have my work read by others who wanted me to write stuff, some of which began to get made, or I rewrote stuff. And suddenly I was in the business.
Post family is that time where you start finding your own voice and kind of that idea of taking the internal and being able to externalize that.
Yeah. And I think a lot of other things conspired to help that. And that's just growing up. I had a tragedy in which my mother was killed in a car accident. I was 30 at the time, or maybe 29. And I fell in love almost at the same moment. And those two things, as different as they seem to be, had a similar effect, which was to say a kind of an emotional catharsis and a confrontation with life's vagaries and its contradictions. And there was no avoiding its effect on me, as inevitably life had already begun to have its effect on me, and experience and friendships and betrayals and all the various things that begin to happen as you grow. So I think that all came together at a certain moment within a couple of years, I think.
In those years, you mention it there, and it is in the book, where you kind of say you were writing scripts that no one wanted to make. And I was wondering, when you reflect on that moment or those pitches and those scripts, what or why do you think maybe they weren't resonating or getting to the point of greenlight or production?
There are 100 reasons. I'm sure, it's very serendipitous about the room that you walk into or the script that is read by a person at a place that is the right moment or the wrong moment for that thing, to that individual who's reading it, to the fashion that exists in the business at that moment, or the shifting fashions, your own abilities, obviously, to have done things well or well enough, your understanding even of how a thing might appeal to a buyer that you did not understand in the way you wrote it. It also has to do, I think, with the various subjects themselves. They were, at least at that moment, not saleable as perceived. They may have been perceived of a certain quality, and that helped me get more jobs. But the funny thing is, I evoked to you a story about a man who gets involved with Eastern thought through a set of coincidences. And if I wrote that in 1978 or 80, right, I then didn't get to do The Last Samurai until 2000 and what, 10, something, I don't know. So 30 years later, I returned to a subject that interested me, not the same subject, but the same shape of a subject.
Yeah.
And now suddenly it was a thing that a movie star jumped on and the studio was willing to finance, and it happened. And I don't necessarily mean that I was ahead of the curve. I just mean that it was somehow that the stars had aligned to make it a thing that was desirable.
As you say, I'm saying it less eloquently, that idea of something in the zeitgeist work.
Well, that is Lear, isn't it? That the ripeness is all.
Yeah. When you do write, do you have a defined process? In the book, you mentioned outline is the first thing you'll write and the first thing you'll abandon. I'm guessing then outline is the first thing you do, but do you...
Yeah, I would even before it becomes an outline, I think that Marshall and I, we tend to talk about the characters and we tend to write about them without any purpose. There may be details about them, maybe scenes that you imagine. They're just, or just their deeper motivations, or anything that you write. And it could end up being no more than a paragraph or two. But I do think that the dramatis personae are the first thing of interest. Or you try to imagine who might be part of this universe, and you create a panoply of characters, many of whom you then later abandon, but who might be part of a story like this in this ambient universe. And so, did there need to be someone in authority in a situation in which that was obligatory? Was there someone who was a nemesis? Was there someone who was, what were the obstacles? What were the wishes? And people emerge out of the mist to be those people, and then they get combined or abandoned or whatever. So I think there's some period of meditation, and I'll call it that, on people and on themes even. What is this movie really about? And it may be a thing that you never talk about in the script, but it's important to you. What makes it personal? And when I say personal, I do not mean from my experience. I mean from what is important to me psychologically, politically, socially. What are those things that this story might touch on? And I think it just invests the story with something that's more meaningful to you and could keep you going, or lead you in directions that are good to be reminded of. So I would say those things first, and then we would try to create an outline. And that means, obviously, depending on the nature of the genre, and genre is an important word in this too, because inevitably certain things either adhere to or subvert genre, but genre is always hovering there, informing it, either in its presence or its absence. It's there.
Yeah.
And part of it is also what is obligatory. Well, there's a moment when these two characters meet. Okay. And there's a moment when they discover that all is not as it seems to be, or, whatever it is. And it's easy to just, I mean, not easy, but it's good to just sort of say, well, that probably happens in the first act. So put it there. And well, there's probably a moment in which they despair, and, and I would put that there, and that sounds, hoary, but it's not. It's just when you build a building, you dig the foundation first, and you pour concrete, and you have to have a set of architectural plans if you want the building to stand up. It's got to be weight bearing, and the structure has to be of a story. It has to be weight bearing. It's a good word I always like when in writing. Does this armature support the weight of what's to come? And I've built a little bit with a friend of mine who's a wonderful carpenter, and I've been his grunt assistant, and I've watched him without plans. I've watched him, understand how to create either foundations or weight bearing loads of beams and trusses and buttresses and things. And that's there's an analogy there that's really helpful.
Yeah, I also love just the language or the word obligatory, because it sounds like, and correct me if I'm misinterpreting, also what you're talking about is that idea of, if you're making a romance movie and there's an audience there, they expect to see the leads kiss at some point, and if you don't deliver, you lose them.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think, and then your job as a writer is to find different solutions to a problem that thousands of writers of romantic comedies have dealt with before you. And it's the other analogy to me is about the composition of music, where there are only 8 white keys and 5 black keys, and yet we seem to keep being able to create interesting, melody and composition.
Definitely. Which, very loosely, it's a loose segue, but I'm curious in the process. I think the heavy lifting in writing is done in rewriting a script.
Sure.
You have your 90 to 100, 120 pages, whatever it may be. I was wondering how you manage that process, and how does Ed, the writer, deal with notes?
It's an endlessly fascinating process, because there is inevitably defensive belief and the defending of one's own process to think that a thing was already working, or had to have been made to work already before it's read by someone. I think that someone and the moral authority that you grant them is also really important. I have found that someone who's really good at giving notes understands that what is very important is that you don't vitiate that moral authority by a bad note, that a good note earns you extraordinary creds with a writer. If you have an observation, because I've been on the other side as a producer working with great writers, that a good note is like a life raft. It's a life preserver thrown to a writer who's solved a problem as best they could. And yet, if they're really a good writer, they will in fact just reach for and cling to a good note. On the other hand, if it's accompanied by 3 bad notes or more arbitrary notes, it also I think it takes away some of their willingness to open themselves to a note, because you're now suspect. And I think that the process of giving notes should be one of sculpting. In other words, when you first free the statue from the stone as a sculptor, you are creating shapes, and you're creating the size of the actual figure in the stone. And that's the first order of business. And you can then increasingly refine that process. And I think it's usually a big mistake of those less trained in the process of writing to give you notes that are incremental dialogue notes and typos abutting very significant observations about the script itself. So that I find myself, in answering your question, I think that the degree to which I am interested in and willing to and eager even to respond to notes are a factor of how good I think those notes are. And there are people who are quite good at it. It's a thing that I have prided myself on with other writers. I want to be that person who is participating, but helpful in the process, but also respectful of the process. And so I vacillate. I can be infuriated by notes. I could be grateful for them. I can be both. I can, and it is, if it's understood to be a process, that it's often not the note, it's the note behind the note. A lot of people are not trained to write, but they have their opinions, and their opinions are legitimate if they feel like, I just don't feel that this character really interests me, or this feels slow at this moment in the second act. And it's not because it's necessarily slow or long. It's because perhaps the beat before in the first act hadn't cemented that relationship well enough for you to be invested to then want to follow that relationship in the second act.
Yeah.
But they didn't know how to give that note. And sometimes it's your job to try to listen deeply and actively to what they're really saying. And sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong, and sometimes they're trying to serve an agenda that's not your agenda, and their agenda is just to make it more full of action or more, the horrible thing is someone to use the word funnier. I mean, because as if that's a thing that you can actually control. It's you either know how to do that or you don't, but there are ways to get there.
Yeah.
But it's not by saying this needs to be funnier here.
Do you always wear the writer-director cap, or can you switch one off to focus on the other? So is director Ed hard on writer Ed when he reads his scripts, or?
Well, back it up for a second.
Yeah.
Because yes, I've been on the set at times with things that I've written and tried to then put them on their feet and saying, what the fuck was this writer thinking, and fire him and redo it there. And that's a process that happens with every good writer or every director working, even with a great writer's work. Things that you discover in the process, that the reality, the realpolitik of the time you have, or the set that you built, or what the actors' feelings are, or any number of things that are happening to that organic thing, which is a movie, the circumstances have changed, and then things change. But back it up to the writer. See, I think that the only good writer is a writer who is also imagining the job of the director and the actor. I think that writer should be able to try to go through that actor's process of character and of transition and of obstacle and all of the Stanislavski virtues and all of the different senses of what an actor, how they approach their process. And the more that a writer can have done that, the easier it is for an actor to do and feel like it's cheating. So that's first. Similarly, you can't ask them to do things that are physically impossible to stage. And I remember, and I probably did it a lot in the beginning, you write a scene in which two young people sit down to meet each other for the first time, and they're in a restaurant, and the waiter brings the menu, and they begin talking, and 5 lines later, they've got to get up and leave, and the waiter is bringing the check, and they haven't even been served their wine. I mean, you have to, you have to actually put yourself into the reality of moments, so as to think about how not to oblige an actor to do something to make a transition. We have an expression Marshall and I always use, and I think it might be mine, where you're asking an actor to go around a corner on 3 wheels. And they will do it. They'll try to do anything. And believe me, they can save your ass a million times. But I cannot tell you the number of times that an actor has said to me, I can't make this transition. Or conversely, the opposite, which is, I don't need all those lines. to make that transition. I can act that. That can happen to me on screen as the other person is talking. And if you can show me going through that, then I could get there. So it works both ways in that regard.
Okay. One of the things I love from the book is the scene is two truths coming together, changing each other. When you are then working on scripts, would you be, when you get to the point that you're going back through and you're rewriting, would you do a draft with that in mind almost and going, are we hitting this?
I mean, I do know that scenes, as scene work, that scenes tend to have a winner and a loser, that someone's action is stronger than someone else's action, or someone's action overpowers someone's action, which only makes the other person's action stronger for the next scene, because they're thwarted. But you want to understand those lines, certainly. So you want to clarify those lines in a draft. But I also find that a way of writing different drafts are almost going through the draft character by character, that a draft is for that character. I want to follow that character arc and that character's journey or their ambition or whatever it is you're looking for, and just literally chart that character. And I take a certain amount of pride that in a bunch of the movies that I've done, the supporting actors have come out surprisingly well in terms of their performances, the recognition by other people, awards, blah blah blah. But that's because I've attended to them as much as I've tried to attend to the protagonists, and that comes with an additional drafts, really, because your temptation initially is not to favor them. Although sometimes in your draft you realize you've given them the movie and your protagonist is passive or has suffered, and you go, oh, now what do I do?
And I think that's a great piece of advice. I was going to ask then, how do you know, or how do you decide which ones to write? I was curious as to, let's say with Legends of the Fall, why you chose to find what you call the perfect writer for that film as opposed to writing it yourself.
It's funny. It's funny you say that. I came upon my copy of the book that I began writing notes in when I was 22 or 23 years old. And I did not make that movie till I was 40. So obviously I had a lot of thoughts. I think at that moment that I began, that my own confidence in writing was not nearly as it grew to be. I first found Alvin, and then that didn't work, and yet it didn't take a genius to think about him. But it wasn't until after I wrote Glory that I rewrote Glory that I began to gain more confidence in my ability. But in terms of Legends, I'd already begun a process with it before that began. So that process was with another writer. It was with Bill Whitliff. And then, and when that did not work, my relationship with Susan, with whom I'd worked now for several years, was very close. And I realized at that moment, and have kept a certain amount of this recognition, that I have benefit of my own ideas as the director. I'm not going to be inhibited from them, but to be able to have benefit of a really talented another writer, a collaborator, which is what I learned working with Marshall, that process could be applied to John Logan, to Stephen Knight, to Tom Stoppard, to Stephen Gagin, brilliant writers of in many ways ability more than mine. And believe me, I had no hesitation trying to enforce my own vision as well. But what you come up with is a third thing that's better than yours or his, and that becomes that thing that you end up doing. So that's nothing new, by the way. I think a lot of really, really talented directors over the years, whether they take writing credit or not, are indeed writers, and believe that they're writing the film along with that writer. And if you read about what it was like with, how Truffaut worked, or how, oh gosh, how William Wyler worked. I mean, it just there was that understanding that there were that finally that director was, if not the author, then at least a co-author of that film.
And you allude to it as well in the book that the process of actually writing the film doesn't stop with the script. When you get to edit,
But even before editing, I mean, in the process of making it, if you're being present, if you're really paying attention, you're watching things change, and you have to be supple. You have to be willing to address those changes, or else you're going to be fucked in the editing room and stuck with things that don't work. And much better to try to be solving things as you're going. And that's happened to me several times, where this story, this subplot, this sequence, it's not working. And let's address it now. Let's try to analyze why and give it more. And part of that often has to do with writing or rewriting.
Something I really appreciate and also needed to hear in the book is coverage is God's way of giving you a chance to rewrite in the editing room. Because I think coverage has kind of become a dirty word and as a bad rap. That quote feels like a principle. And I was wondering, was that always your opinion, or did you come to that realization at a particular point where you're like, oh, I kind of...
Well, I think because I'd done a bunch of television where coverage was obligatory, where coverage had to happen because that's the only way you could get things done. Although once we began doing 30-something, we began doing a lot of things in one, and some of the great work that we loved were things done in one. I think there's a great phrase, I think it's from Arabic culture, which is it says, praise Allah but tie your camel. And I think there are actually ways to do both. I think certainly many things should be done in one, and it's just become a little bit fetishized to me. It's become a notion of, oh God, did you see all that they did and everything was done? That was a 12-minute shot. Yeah, that's there's a certain skill in doing that, but the truth is, once the Steadicam was invented, and once you can previs, and once you realized, particularly even now with some CG things, you can do anything that way. Is it the best? Is it as it should be? I mean, look, Sam Mendes in 1917 just decided that kind of narrative and momentum was the sine qua non of the movie. And it was almost, in some sense, it was an artistic conceptual art piece to decide that was the principle of it, and more power to him. And it worked. And I've done things that are not like that, but that have, tried to, animate a scene. There are also ways that you're doing that, when you're doing that you can just give yourself a little bit of a bolt hole. You can give yourself a little bit of a, there's that game we used to play as children called Chutes and Ladders. I don't know if you know that game. It's not bad to have built in a little bit of a failsafe. Or you're doing scenes that are all done in one, but you really like the first half of take one and the great half of take 7. But you've then understood that there might be a way that you could anticipate that and build in just a little bit of a it's not a cheat even, it just will work, that then would allow you to do that. And then you'll make your film better. And nobody will know because there are 100 different ways to disguise that. It could be just a blur past the frame as someone goes in and out of, they block the frame for a moment, or there are 100 different ways to do it. And these days with CG, there are 101 way to do it. Why be orthodox? There are orthodox filmmakers whom I really admire, and you know who they are, and they're great. It's just not who I am. I'm prizing the storytelling. I'm prizing the content over the form.
Whatever serves story best.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's coverage.
Yeah.
So let's say you've a script, you've a green light, you've cast, you're in prepped, and you've some time for rehearsals. When you speak about glory in the book, you mentioned that realizing kind of during the rehearsal process that the best thing you could do was probably just shut up, hold tight, that trying to over-direct there would have been maybe the wrong decision to make. But you created a space or an environment for those performers So my question is, how did you and how do you facilitate the rehearsal process to keep your actors aligned, doing meaningful work, and moving forward in the right direction? How prepped are you going in? Do you come in with a very clear rehearsal plan, or how do you prep that?
Well, first of all, that's one place where I was a little bit of an advantage. I was behind the game in 100 different ways. I was behind the curve in terms of understanding lenses and understanding editing. There were 100 ways in which I did not know what I was doing. But one thing that I did know something about had to do with rehearsal. I had directed plays, ensemble plays in the theater at that point for, I'd done it for years and years, and I was still young, but that was the thing that I had done. And I understood, at least mostly through experiment with trial and error, that there was a way to create a feeling of an ensemble. There were certain exercises having to do with character. There were certain exercises having to do with improvisation. There were certain exercises having to do with physicalization. And some were research and conversation and just a kind of colloquy among people talking. And my favorite, which is a story I think I told in the book, but if not, it's a story about Mike Nichols directing a production on stage. And Neil Simon, whose work he had done, Mike Nichols did several Neil Simon plays before. Neil Simon decided, this time he wanted to direct. He wanted to learn to direct. So rather than sit in the back of the house, he was going to sit in the front row and listen to Mike Nichols talk to the actors as they rehearsed. And he said, and they would come in the morning and they would talk about what had happened in the news that day and what they'd had for dinner and gossiping and who was screwing who. And the play got better. But he never heard him say a word actually about, Stanislavski or Boleslavsky or Uta Hagen or Stella Adler or anybody. It just got better. And there is a certain amount of that unspoken communication between a director and actors in the way that they talk about things, in what he asks them to talk about, even as they're beginning to create a template for just an improvisation. One way that I learned, actually, and I just found it by trial and error, I was once directing a production of Mice and Men, and it's about a group of men who were working in a ranch house in the 30s in America. And I realized it would be a great improv to have them go backstage and work with the carpenters in terms of building the set, because then they would be taking on their roles and doing an actual task. And so that was just a revelation to me when it just happened. And so giving actors a task to do as if they were in their characters. In Glory, it might have been cleaning their weapons. It might have been building whatever it was. So I guess I was a little ahead of the curve that way. But what I very quickly learned is that they had so much to bring to that piece. And it wasn't just that they had done research, although some had. It's what they had internally that was unknown to me, and yet thrilling to see as it emerged, that it was to try to create circumstances in which that could emerge. And what I would do a lot of the times is I would very subtly be writing notes to myself, or even without even writing. It could be pieces of dialogue. It could be bits of behavior. It could be little things there that I would then be able to reinvest in a different scene or at a moment that I was just stealing madly from what they were bringing.
Okay, I love it. I was going to ask that question as well, as that throughout that process, then, are you allowing the work and the improvisation feed its way back into story, or would you rewrite them based on some of the discoveries in that room?
Both. Both. I think, first of all, it's increasingly rare that you actually have the time to do these rehearsals. And a lot of actors now that you're working with haven't been trained in the theater and are rather, some are very interested and eager to do that. And some are very self-conscious about going into a situation that they've never done before. It sounds like an odd thing, but because it was a contemporary piece, but when we did Love and Other Drugs, there was a lot of stuff that Jake Gyllenhaal and Annie Hathaway and I were able to do together that also found its way into the script, having to do with sex, having to do with how a guy picks up women, because that was Jake's character, and what's his MO. Similarly, I do write in the book about a moment of rehearsal that I did on Courage Under Fire with Meg Ryan and Matt Damon and Lou Diamond Phillips, where we were doing a set of improvisations or even a set of scene stuff, and I was able to get the sound guys to give me a
mortar rounds, kind of.
Yeah, mortar rounds
Great.
and helicopter sounds and all of that to give them an ambient thing to work with, which meant even how to raise their voices, because you can't have that when you're filming necessarily on a soundstage. But if they get accustomed to that and it doesn't seem fakey, it's how many times have you seen it being faked in a club scene when actors are raising their voice in a way that does not seem at all real, right? And because they can't put in the track. But it was Meg who just, because she's really smart, just came up with that wonderful line when she's shot and they're saying, "Are you okay?" And she just turns to them and says, I gave birth to an 8-pound baby, asshole. And, it's like, oh man, that's going in the movie. Because she had given birth to a baby, 2 years before or something. And she had something to bring to it.
I love that. That's underlined in the book, actually, in my copy, just in terms of the helicopter sounds and mortar rounds and all of that going off. I thought it was great. I also loved how you dealt with Meg Ryan not flying in the helicopter as well. I thought that was a brilliant solution.
Well, I actually think that one reason why they pay us is not because of the skills that we have, but rather the ability to figure it out on the day. It's problem solving. It's a combination of problem solving and speed dating. The clock is running and the meter on the taxi is just turning, and it's your job to figure something out in a certain period of time and still give the illusion that you're calm and you're not freaking everybody else around you, particularly the actors, that you've got to get this done literally before that sun sets.
Yeah. I was wondering, when you were faced with, when you're talking about Siege, maybe not getting the performance you were hoping for from Bruce Willis, and I was wondering, how do you respond in those instances? And do you then go to start thinking about the edit and how do I put it together, or what's your process there?
Yeah, and it's not just been Bruce Willis there, and I won't mention any names besides Bruce Willis, because that was so egregious. But yeah, you start, if an actor is incapable of doing a monologue or doing long bits of dialogue, you're already thinking about, well, there can be this cutaway to this other actor who's listening, or a bit of behavior, whatever, that you can weave that together. And, it's also been done with great actors, and they know it too, that they may have loved what they did in the first 3 takes, and then they did something about the beginning of the scene, but they did it in take 8, and oh my God, I like that better. Or they just discovered it because you often haven't had time for rehearsal. And in fact, the first few takes are rehearsal. And then you discover something, but then you're already locked into a set of blocking. And how do you fix that? And how do you be able to pre-cut it in your head so that you can preserve those bits of magic when they happen? Because the best moments are when it happens just once and it's in focus, and so you can't plan for serendipity, but once it happens, the question is, how do you preserve it?
Yeah.
There's a moment that I don't talk about in the book. John Toll, we were shooting the scene in Legends of the Fall where Henry Thomas gets machine gunned on the wire. And it was a very complicated day's work, and we were behind, and it took them forever because it was before CG, and the effects guys were laying the squibs on him and all around, and it was just taking for fucking ever. And the sun is going down, and we're finally ready to shoot, and the sun is literally coming down, going right in the barrel of the lens. And John says, "We can't shoot it." I said, "John, we're shooting it." He goes, "Well, fine, it won't match anything because that's bright orange and it's direct backlight, and you've done this whole sequence, and you've got these intercuts there, and it's never going to work." And I said, "Well, all right, fuck, well, we'll find out, and we'll have to do it again maybe, but fucking shoot it." And he goes, "Okay, roll." And we shoot it, and When the squibs explode, they send this mist up into the sky, into the air around Henry, which catch the light and become this hellish ambience of death around him. And it's not the reason that John Toll won the Oscar, but it did not hurt that this thing happened that we never would have planned, and it just happened. And that's often the way, where things just happen once, and they beggar your imagination of what you would have done if you'd been able to pre-visualize the entire sequence. Because movies are about life, and my capacity to imitate life can only go so far, because that leaves out the improvisation of life and the vagaries of life.
And the magic.
And then, well, the magic most of all, yes.
How do you help, or how do you work with performers and help them past kind of protection of the self and urge them into work that's challenging, but it can be much more rewarding and revelatory because maybe we haven't seen them like that?
I mean, that is obviously, that's person to person, and everyone has their own constellation of obstacles and impediments. Obviously, the best actors are those for whom that's mother's milk, for whom that's the sweet spot, where they want to go, they want to get to. They have some fluidity, some access, or some desire to be released from the bonds of ego and self-image and self-concern and self-importance and self-protection. The best actors are the least protected. It's actually a hallmark of a inexperienced or second-rate actor who is so concerned with self. And there are ways with a young actor that I have found that I can help them through some of that, because that's new to them. But they're always an actor that actually has that capacity within them that you've identified, and that's why you've cast them. You sense that willingness. The hardest is with an actor who is set in their image and believe that what they're serving is that image rather than the character. And you're going to get what you cast and not a lot more. And it's your fault for casting them. You should have tried to identify it by looking at their other work, by getting to know them as best you can in a room, even if they're not reading the script. And in some cases, it's fine. I always thought that there's that British actor, Charles Dance, who's a really good actor, but the key is that Charles Dance always thought he was the hero, even though he was always the villain. And it was going to be that way. And so all you needed to do was have Charles Dance be Charles Dance, but put him in the role of the villain, and it was delicious because he thought he was the hero.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. There's a lovely phrase in the book that you mention, Liberty says, which is, some actors let the light in.
Yeah.
I was curious as to whether you think it's possible for actors to learn to let the light in, or is that just something that, in your experience, performers have or don't?
I'd like to think it's possible, but I'm not sure it is, really. I think that is one of those indefinable gifts that certain people are granted in their life. Did you see the Steve Zalian Ripley? Did you see that?
I haven't watched it yet. It's on the list.
It's okay. The name of that actor escapes me right now. I would have said it.
Andrew Scott.
Yeah. It's so remarkable because he so often is still and silent, and it's all happening. It's almost like watching a silent movie at times. And that's why the great silent movie actors were who they were. These things were happening without words on their faces. And it's never even, sometimes it's a factor of intellect, but I've worked with actors who actually, I'm not convinced, actually understand the scene as well as they might. And yet, what happens with their face in that moment is so interesting. You are let in, and you want to know what's happening. I think it helps for an actor that's what preparation is, and that's what the technique is. Technique is actually having something to think about, having these things happening internally in your head, that if you are thinking about them, the camera's going to be interested in knowing what you are thinking about, even if you're not talking. And that will look very much like the thing we're describing now. And it may be a pathway to it for an actor down the road to maybe gain the thing, and maybe some of that is teachable or at least learnable.
I love that you mentioned Andrew Scott, another Irishman. But if you haven't
Yeah,
seen, have
yeah.
you watched All of Us Strangers?
Oh, yeah. Oh, well, it's a great performance. It's a
Yeah,
great performance. No, and by the way, I saw him, the first time I saw him is when he played the priest on Fleabag,
yeah,
which was just so good. And as different as when it was impish and clever, and it was moving, and the total antithetical thing that he does in Ripley, which is equally fascinating, but of a different thing entirely.
yeah. I think he's a stunning performer.
Yeah,
Love
yeah.
to watch him. So one of the things that I think will strike anyone who watches your movies is scale. And
Mhm.
I'm thinking the blowing up of the bus in The Siege, Final Battle, The Last Samurai, and the tank battle in Courage Under
Mhm.
Fire as some examples. In the book, you talk about this idea of when you're talking about CG, kind of the laws of physics and reality. And there's something I think just so visceral and awe-inspiring by your imagery because it's real.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the first people that I worked with was a guy named Paul Lombardi. And Paul Lombardi was the son of, oh God, what was his father's name? His father had been the special effects man on Apocalypse Now, and Paul had been a young man working for his father during that movie. And I remember him talking at one point about what does real time, real scale mean? And it means that we in the audience have some innate understanding, even if it's nothing. We've never been in a battle, we've never been in a war, we've never been in a horse race or whatever it is, and yet we have some reality principle built into us about what that must be like. And the minute that it's violated, its effect is to pull us out narratively from a story. And I can give you a for instance, which I just happened to have seen recently. I watched Dune, the second one, recently. Well, it's magnificent, right? It's magnificent in certain ways in which they've come to understand how to use CG to make it seem realistic and beautiful and hide the seams of the digital world, right? And then they'll cut to a shot in which there are 8 zillion soldiers, or the camera will do something that it's just impossible that you ever would have thought that a camera could do. And at that moment, it's like, oh, I'm watching this science fiction movie. I'm not watching a story. I'm admiring the technology, or I'm astonished by the form again. And to me, it pulls me out of the contextual narrative and of that moment. So that's what I'm talking about. That the key to, I think certain people are beginning to get this. The key to the use of those things, those tools, are in service of authenticity and verisimilitude, rather than the hyper expression of something that because you can do it, you do it. The great painters, if you look at the Rembrandt portraiture, which are the most stirring and insightful portraits, 2/3 of the canvas is black. It's often what you don't see. It's not how much you can see. And that is, when you think of the word direction, it means you're directing the audience's focus towards things. And that's why the great cinematographers are those who are not afraid of darkness. They underlight because they know that they can help direct the movie.
I love all of that. When it comes then to scale and directing scale and
Mhm.
figuring out where you're going to put a camera and how you're going to make things work and direct the audience's attention. If we were to maybe take The Last Samurai, you mentioned shooting the final battle in that in the book, you said 8 cameras rolling, but
Yeah.
you mentioned working with a storyboard artist and endless meetings to figure that whole sequence out. But I was wondering then, in that process, where do you start? Or where did you start in order to actually really break that down into bite-sized chunks and make sure you were directing the audience where you wanted them to be?
Well, I mean, this is, it probably would have been worth a whole chapter talking about what a storyboard artist is, or its equivalent now, even sometimes with a CG artist, and sometimes they're the same thing and sometimes they're not. A good storyboard artist is sitting with you and you are telling the story again, you to him and him to you. And often he is someone who's going to be a director or aspired to be a director or could have been, but for a quirk of personality where they just weren't as good with people as they were with a pen, and they didn't want to deal with the scrum of real life and the politics where they would be able to be in their little world and create this without interference in some way. At least they could idealize it. Because a lot of times in storyboards, you idealize things that then you can't do. But that process, it's headbanging because you are going back into your script, which you're facing the practical world. The rubber is going to meet the road. You've got the script, you've got the approval, and you have X amount of time, and you only have X number of days to do this sequence, right? Or you're trying to figure out how many days do you need to do this sequence, because there are certain ways in which there is a minimum of setups to establish the exposition and the narrative of going from A to D or A to S. How do you get there? How many beats would you even need in the visual storytelling to accomplish what the script is doing? And you walk every step. You walk it again and again. It's redundancy. You're really trying to see your way through a thing. It's thrilling and it's agonizing because you're drained, and a lot of times you're trying to direct 6 days work or 7 days work in a single session of 5 hours, and your head is throbbing and you're worried that you've not done anything except the minimum necessary, that you've left inspiration behind. And then sometimes a great storyboard artist will take that and then come back to you and say, yeah, but what about if you, and they will have done something. You'll go, oh, bless you. Or they will have done something and you look at it, you say, are you smoking crack? We can't do this. Nice idea. Thank you very much. Next, let's go back and do it just in some more simplified way. But it's a great process. And when you talk about scale, I mean, scale is a part of your palette. Scale is a necessary part of a director's palette. And if you eliminate it because of economics, something can be lost. So the key is how to find those moments where you can actually do them within the scope of what you're being given.
Do you think that in today's environment and industry that you could make a movie like The Last Samurai where you actually have
Well,
extras?
I watched what they did with Shogun on television, and some of the things they did were so lovely. They used CG to do, and there was great respect for some of the intricacies and nuances of Japanese ritual and tradition. I thought it was great. But when it got down to, people fighting or doing anything like that, they just basically found a way narratively to avoid it. They just didn't do it because I don't think they realized, or they could have done it in a way that was half-assed. There's, again, I was referring to Dune, which I just happened to have seen a few days ago. There's one scene when they get into that kind of thing, but, there's been so much of it lately and well done. I mean, I think some of the work done on Game of Thrones was so wonderfully done that it raised the bar. And if you do less than that, then you're gonna, in fact, be found wanting. I mean, I think Game of Thrones, the guys who did that, particularly the special effects coordinator, the stunt coordinator, the visual effects guys, all these guys, they were able to find a very interesting middle place where the use of real time and real scale took advantage of some of the CG elements and found something that was very scary and beautifully done. So that was a good example of how it can happen. It was not inexpensive, or it was timely, and it was painstaking, but it was very, very well done.
Yeah, good examples. What about the edit? You talk about working with Steve Rosenblum and how Steve will show you things in a way that you didn't expect them to maybe be conceived. And I was wondering how important you find that element of the edit, and then how you manage that collaboration with your editor.
Well, it must be said that he's one of my oldest and closest friends. We met in film school. We learned together. He cut my first student film and everything since. And it's been, hand in glove for both of us. And so he's a formidable intelligence. And it turns out he has great hands and is quite adroit at trying to make things work. But he also revels in being contrary and counterintuitive, which can be just so enlightening and so maddening, and sometimes both at the same time. I think sometimes he just wants to stir the pot so that I'm not getting complacent and say, well, what about this? Or had you considered this? And sometimes you say, fuck no, just do it as I've imagined. And sometimes it's the opposite. When you say, oh, Jesus, who thought of that? I never would have thought of that. And that obviously makes my work better and more interesting, and makes the narrative more interesting, and makes I actually saw a wonderful, wonderful thing. I wish I'd cut it out. It was a description of what good writing looks like as opposed to bad writing, but it's what it looked like in terms of the use of sentences and the length of sentences and fragments and quotes, and it was that a short sentence was red and a longer sentence was blue, and a sentence with a lot of clauses was green, and they showed you a visual representation of writing. And when you think about editing, the symphonic musical notion of editing is something that's not often talked about, that it's often breaking up rhythms or finding new ways to tell narrative within a scene that brings that scene alive. And what is the difference between that and the editing on soap opera? Well, the editing on soap opera is, here we are listening to a metronome as it tells the story, cut to him and cut to her and cut to the master, and then they leave. And you're asleep by the end of the scene. And so what a great editor does is find ways to wrong foot the audience, or to draw them forward, or to hide something from them. That's also what great staging does sometimes, is that you can play a scene away from the audience and they go in, and then they want this cut, and then you give them the cut. It's something that we've learned together, and I dread the day that I'm not able to work with him, because it will be there are hugely talented editors besides Steve, but the fun is actually just the two of us being together.
You mentioned the idea there that Steve can be contrary or challenge you just to challenge you. There's almost a thread throughout the book, actually, which I have a bunch of little tabs on, because it seems like you have a very healthy relationship with being challenged, and the idea that people challenging your ideas will make them better.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's like the way that you temper steel, the way that you make a blade, which I watch these artists do in Japan. The steel, the best, finest steel is actually soft. and it is beaten again and again, and dipped in it is cooled and then heated up again and beaten again, and it's folded, and the process of is really a trial. And that's true about an idea. That's true about a story. That understanding that things can be questioned and things can be improved and things can be worked. I learned that early, and I don't know how I accepted it, except that I think, well, I don't know. I mean, I know also that I always loved team sports. I was always an athlete, and I felt you could see why a soccer team won a game when they might not have been as skilled as another team, because they were a team, or the same with a baseball team or a basketball team. I mean, that there is something of a process of taking, understanding film more than any other is the composite amalgamation of other people's ideas and other people's influence. That costumer is telling a story. The cinematographer is telling your story. The editor is telling your story. The AD who's figuring out the schedule is influencing the story, because it's not clear what a story is. A story is something that is this ephemeral, indescribable thing that is subject to being influenced. It will keep changing its nature. And I know there are writer-directors who literally are utterly determinative, and they will over-determine a thing. And some of them are just so gifted that they can do that. But I'm not. I am capable of adjudicating all those contributions and making decisions that emphasize one and diminish another. And that's just my adaptation to what I perceive my job to be.
I think it's great. I loved it. It made me think Ed Catmull, president of Pixar, has a book called Creativity Inc. And in that they talk about this idea of the brain trust that they have on projects, which is a small group of people then who would like litmus test ideas and push them and question them. And it just seems like you have built your own brain trust, which
I think, by the way, some of those movies that Pixar did are wonderful examples of storytelling. I think so too. But there's a danger in that too, and the danger is when it's done by people who are only semi-creative. That's the teams at some of these streamers where it's a Silicon Valley idea that you're not creating, you're polishing, or you're shaping, you're trying to package and make something acceptable before the fact that is about being pleasing, as opposed to being intrinsic to what the thing itself is, because they're retailers. So they're preparing a package for the market. And that's very different than the package you're describing, because a brain trust is, there have been great writers' rooms in television too. That I think are like the brain trust. I mean, when I think about the guys who did The Wire, George Pelecanos sitting there in a room with Dennis Lehane, and that's magnificent. But that's not what's happening in some of those other rooms. That's a very different thing.
Yeah.
So but yes, the brain trust, yes. And even that phrase brain trust, I think, probably comes from either Lincoln and his cabinet members. That Doris Kearns wrote that book called Team of Rivals, or it's about Franklin Roosevelt there with all those the men in his brain trust. And I think it is a very real thing.
Yeah, I must check.
It has the word trust in it. They don't mean like trust, like a bank trust. I think they mean they trusted each other.
Yeah, I think so. And trust is one of the things that always gets mentioned I don't think
Yeah,
I've done an episode where trust doesn't come up at some point.
you bet. And a lot of times it's me saying to a studio, you know, trust me, and that I'm saving you from yourself. On the other hand, they've been hoodwinked so many times by others who have said, you know, trust me, I won't come in your mouth, and they've gotten, you know, badly screwed by it. So trust is one of those things that you earn, and some people are willing to give and others not.
You pose a very eloquent question in the book when you say, how do you give a musical voice to a story? And
Mm.
I was curious about how you begin your collaboration with your composers.
Well, first of all, I mean, I've been blessed when you think about James Horner and Hans Zimmer and James Newton Howard. I mean, Stumpy Walden. These are really such talented artists in their own right.
Yeah,
But there's always a thing that you do that's a great thing and a horrible thing, which is you tempt the movie. And even if you tempt it with their own work, you're doing them a disservice, because the last thing they want to do is imitate themselves. And you know, every composer I've ever known hates temp, just hates. You even have to listen to it if they could avoid it, and many of them do avoid it. And there are certain moments in which I finally have to say this to a composer when I'm working with them, no matter how talented. Listen, can you just please listen to the temp of what we did, so that we can talk about it in a way that you will understand? Because I am a half-assed musician, which is to say, I can read music, I can play piano horribly, I can play guitar a little better, but I only know enough to be dangerous. And which is to say, I can talk about things, but I can't have any idea how better to accomplish them. And with each of those really wonderful men with whom I've worked more than once, I think there's come a moment which I have frustrated them utterly, or they've been unable to do something that I've wanted them to do. And yet we've always gotten through it and been satisfied. It's a delicious process to sit there with a gifted artist who inevitably, particularly these days where you can sample things, well, they'll just say, well, how's this and this and this. And even as they're noodling at the piano, it's all being recorded. You know, they're keeping it all digitally. So you can say, you remember, like about 5 minutes ago, there was a little thing that you did. And they go, well, you mean, but oh, this, that, and you know, but you're in the presence of a different kind of genius. I mean, I have friends who are painters, and I like nothing more than to sit in their studio and watch them paint. Or maybe I'll just read or write, or I'll sleep. But it's like being in a different world, a different creative world, and it's delicious. But you talk about theme, you talk about character. You have the same conversations as if you're talking to another writer. They just have a different way of interpreting it.
temp was going to be one of my questions. Do you send with temp tracks or
You
reference
have to,
palettes?
because you're selling it to the studio, or you're doing a preview. You have to do it.
And if there wasn't temp, the first note you would get back is it needs music.
Exactly.
Can you tell us anything about what's next then for Ed Zwick, or what you're working on at the minute?
I mean, Ed Zwick's having trouble, you know, getting movies made the same way everyone is, because the movies that Ed Zwick wants to make are more wedded to some of the things that he's done before, and fashions change, and the people who are in the positions of making those decisions are maybe less inclined to do those kinds of movies. There aren't that many movies being made for adults now at scale. I'd still like to be able to do it. There are a couple that I've been working on that I hope I'm going to be able to do, but you just never know. I also would be stupid if I wasn't thinking of something that would fit more into the world of what is being made, and yet still try to serve myself. You know, that would still have some originality, or have some appeal that was not just marketed or targeted, that had some sense of being itself, as opposed to an imitation of something else, or the reference to other things. I still have the fire in my belly to do it. I still have the energy to do it. Getting older is a very interesting phenomenon in life, as it is in work. And, you know, in some sense, writing this book was an adaptation to it a little bit, because COVID had hit, and I didn't want to go on a stage and do it with masks and in those rows. I just didn't want to do that. The experience of making movies has been so delicious for me and so interactive, that I wanted to, now I could do it again now. So I'm trying to do it.
I know at the beginning of the book, you say you have this hopeful image of a young filmmaker bent over the book, scribbling quotes in a notepad. I've no doubts that that's going to be the case. But in the book, you also mention that the director lives in a lonely world and alienation is kind of part of the gig. What I wanted to say was that I think the book provides more than just insight and advice. Is for me, it felt like I also found in the book a sense of community. I loved it, highly recommended. I gave one away on the podcast, so I'll do more. I'll buy some copies and give them away once this ep goes out as well.
Well, thank you for that. I have to say that I've been overwhelmed with the response, particularly from my peers, from young filmmakers, from people that I knew and those that I didn't, people who did see, they felt seen by it and they felt understood. And because the book is introspective, they responded in kind. And I received letters that were quite extraordinary and very different than the response to a film. People tend to let the film sort of pass by now if it's not the kind of film that really reaches them. And yeah, it was great and what's for dinner. But this was, people's relationship to a book is very different, and particularly a book that aspires to be personal. And that was a treat for me. And conversations like this and those that just appear, they meant a lot. So thanks for that. And I'm hoping that the book has an afterlife. I'm hoping that the book is not only related to this moment, that as it becomes something that teachers know about or other filmmakers know about, that it finds its way to marble down to others over time.
I think it absolutely will. And I think it's an Aaron Sorkin quote on the front that says goes down in terms of like William Goldman's Adventures in the Screen Trade. And I think
that's the gold standard. So yes, if I could be in this,
one of those books.
Well, you take care, and I hope our paths cross again.
And that's a wrap on Ed Zwick. Thank you for listening to the Filmmaker's Playbook. If you're enjoying the show, please share it with a friend and follow and rate us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you have feedback, questions, or topics you'd like me to cover on the show, please put them in the comments section on our Instagram page at the Filmmaker's Playbook Podcast. You can follow me on Instagram at Jason Branagan Director, and you can follow Ed on Instagram at Ed_Zwick_official. Links and social media handles are in the show notes. Join me next week when I talk to creative consultant and director Des Doyle. Until next time.